Early winter of 1891 settled over the high mountain basin with a quiet insistence. Snow dusted the peaks, brittle branches quivered under the first weight of frost, and a thin wind whispered through narrow valleys. Among the scattered homesteads at the basin's edge, John, age 15, had been expelled from his home. The reason was neither unusual nor scandalous, an argument over his intent to leave the valley for the mountains, but it marked a clear division between him and those who remained. The townspeople, gathered at the small general store and near the church steps, observed his departure with restrained disapproval. There were murmurs of impracticality, a few smiles at what they saw as youthful folly, and quiet assumptions that he would return when hardship proved inevitable. If you're interested in how this story unfolds, like, share, and subscribe to follow John's survival through the winter. The local authority figure, a man of measured words and long experience in these highlands, shook his head slowly. "The boy has no provisions for winter above tree line," he remarked to a companion, his voice calm, almost conversational, yet carrying the weight of certainty. No ridicule was needed. The environment itself seemed to pronounce judgment. Snow-laden peaks and narrow ridges spoke with greater authority than any human voice could. Even the harsh, unbroken wind that swept down from the north conveyed warning. John's departure was noted, discussed, and quickly relegated to practical concern rather than drama. John moved through the basin with an economy of motion, his small pack slung across one shoulder, a few essentials strapped to his belt. He paused only briefly to scan the horizon, noting where a ridge jutted against the sky and where a cluster of evergreens might offer temporary shelter from the wind. His hands, numb from early frost, adjusted the straps, while his breath rose in thin clouds that vanished almost immediately in the dry, cold air. He did not speak aloud, nor did he seek any further attention. The few who watched him simply noted the departure and turned back to their routines. There was no cheer, no sorrow, only the quiet, sustained observation of those who understood the mountains demanded their own reckoning. A vulnerable figure, an elderly neighbor with bent posture and slow gait, lingered at the edge of the path. She observed John for a moment longer than most. Her expression conveyed concern tempered by pragmatism. She did not call him back. She did not offer advice or encouragement. Instead, she returned to her modest cabin, carrying water from the well and tending to her small woodpile, aware that winter would demand more than words to survive. The peaks themselves seemed to lean closer as John climbed, snowflakes catching briefly on his coat before being carried away by the wind. Each step upward reminded him of the challenge ahead: isolation, scarcity, exposure. Trees groaned under frost, their needles brittle, a warning etched into the landscape. Every ridge, every hollow, held the potential for hardship. His mind catalogued possible shelters, windbreaks, and water sources without reflection or hesitation. The mountains were impartial, their judgment silent but precise. It was during this early ascent that John noted the first serious signs of an approaching storm. Clouds gathered along the distant ridgelines, and a gray haze settled over the basin. The wind shifted direction and gained strength, carrying a biting chill that penetrated even the heaviest layers. A few low branches bent to the gusts, and he made a mental note to avoid them when constructing temporary shelters. The mountain floor, a mix of rock, frost, and early snow, required careful footing. Each step demanded awareness, energy, and patience. John's decision to leave the valley, though quietly mocked by those he left behind, was now confronted by the impartial reality of the highlands themselves. Amid this quiet, measured pressure, John's resolve remained firm. He adjusted his pack, surveyed the route ahead once more, and proceeded up the slope with deliberate care. The town below faded, muffled by distance and rising snow, and leaving him with the enduring wind, the brittle forest, and the first whispered signs of the storm that would test him in the days to come. John's departure from the valley was marked by quiet practicality rather than ceremony. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the dirt path, their movements slow and deliberate, as they observed him adjusting the straps of his small pack. The storekeeper, leaning against the weathered counter of his shop, nodded in acknowledgement, saying simply, "He'll need what he can carry, nothing more." No further words were offered. The blacksmith, wiping soot from his hands, added, "The mountains will judge him better than any of us." Conversation remained measured, restrained, reflecting an understanding that survival was dictated by endurance and skill rather than sentiment. The mountains loomed above, indifferent and imposing. Rocky ridges stretched into pale gray skies, their slopes dusted with early snow. Each contour hinted at hidden challenges: narrow ledges, sudden drops, patches of ice. Trees bent to the wind, their needles brittle, the branches groaning under frost. The environment itself set the terms. John moved with methodical care, planting each foot deliberately. He did not look back at the valley he left behind, recognizing that hesitation could compromise his journey. An elderly neighbor watched him from a distance, her hands resting on the gnarled handle of a walking stick. She had seen many youths leave in pursuit of independence, but few persisted. Her eyes followed John's progress without comment, recording the difficult ascent in quiet observation. She understood that at 15, the margin for error was small, but that exposure and scarce supplies could quickly overwhelm. There was no offer of guidance or advice. Survival was practical, and she trusted him to measure it for himself. The path John followed wound upward, narrowing as it climbed. Loose stones shifted underfoot, and the cold bit through layers of wool. Streams frozen at the edges glistened under the weak winter sun. His pack carried the essentials: a small kettle, rations compacted for travel, a blanket thick enough to retard frost, and a few tools shaped by local craftsmen. Each item had been chosen with precision, reflecting knowledge imparted by observation rather than instruction. The community figures remained at the valley's base, noting progress intermittently. Their remarks were minimal. "He moves carefully," said one, glancing toward the slopes. Another commented on the weather. "Snow may come sooner than expected." Each statement was neutral, practical, conveying neither worry nor encouragement. In this, the observers mirrored the mountains, impartial, measured, demanding attention through evidence rather than emotion. John paused briefly at a ledge overlooking a small basin, examining a potential campsite for concealment from prevailing winds. He noted the positions of evergreens, the proximity of water, and the orientation of slopes to sunlight. Every choice was a calculation: where to dig, how to anchor shelter materials, and how to limit exposure to frost. The valley receded beneath him, quiet except for the murmur of distant streams and the wind threading through the ridges. He did not linger beyond necessity, moving steadily with energy conserved for the labor ahead. As the ascent continued, he encountered the first patches of snow deep enough to obscure the trail. Footprints quickly vanished in the powder, leaving only the sound of wind and shifting branches. Each step was deliberate, cautious, measured against the potential for slipping or overexertion. John's pace reflected understanding of the terrain and the season, of the mountain's indifference to age or intent. By late afternoon, he had reached a plateau where small pines clustered against the wind. Here, he paused, adjusting his pack once more. The valley was distant, muffled under a veil of frost and the early snow settling over its edges. John's disappearance was complete, not through drama, but through simple, deliberate movement. A logistical execution of departure, measured by steps and observation, are recorded only in the quiet attention of the few who remain to watch. If you're following John's journey, like, share, and subscribe for more detailed frontier survival stories. John paused on a narrow ledge, surveying the ridge where he intended to build his cabin. The slope above was steep, scattered with evergreens, their lower branches laden with frost. Rocks protruded from thin soil, and patches of snow had already begun to gather in small hollows. To the few who had learned of his plan, the notion of constructing a dwelling alone at such elevation seemed impractical. The local authority figure, experienced in timber and winter storms, remarked once to a neighbor, "He will find the logs scarce and the weight of snow unforgiving." The statement was quiet, matter-of-fact, without mockery, but carried a certainty that mirrored the indifference of the mountains themselves. The community considered his idea strange, if not impossible, yet there was no overt derision. Neighbors, a storekeeper, and the blacksmith offered brief acknowledgement, their voices carrying concern more than judgment. "The cold comes sooner than he expects," the blacksmith said, eyes tracing the ridge. "Shelter must be sound, or he will struggle." Each note was practical, grounded in experience. There was no spectacle, no dramatic warning, simply the recognition that survival at this altitude demanded skill, endurance, and caution. John moved among the frost-tipped evergreens, examining possible locations for felling small trees, assessing which logs could be carried without undue strain. Every selection was deliberate, length, thickness, and weight considered against the physical demands of transport over snow and uneven terrain. His hands, gloved and steady, checked bark for rot, adjusted cords for hauling, and measured angles for a rudimentary foundation. The mountain dictated the pace, and John adhered strictly to its demands. Each movement reflected methodical planning rather than improvisation. Wind swept along the ridge, cold and persistent, bending branches to the ground. John noted its direction, anticipating where temporary shelters might provide respite during storms. Frost patterns on rocks and fallen leaves indicated areas prone to early accumulation of snow. Each observation became part of the practical decision-making process. He remained silent, recording the environment in the quiet attention that survival required. The cabin concept itself was unconventional by frontier standards. Logs would be stacked and notched without the assistance of neighbors. The site required hauling materials uphill, where footing was uncertain and exposure complete. To those familiar with the area, the undertaking seemed disproportionate to the boy's age and experience. Yet, John continued, guided by reasoned calculation rather than expectation or approval. He selected a flat area between two small pines, clearing stones and debris with careful sweeps of his gloved hands. The ground was hard with frost, resisting spade and pick alike, yet he worked persistently, knowing the foundation would determine the structure's resilience to snow and wind. Each log was measured against the slope, adjusted to maintain stability and reduce strain from anticipated snow loads. There was no haste, only measured repetition, attention to detail, and constant adjustment to environmental feedback. As John prepared the first logs for placement, he observed the ridges above where snow clouds were forming. The wind carried a fine spray of frost along the ground, a signal of the changing weather that would soon test any shelter erected. His pace slowed to match the rhythm of observation, each task informed by necessity rather than imagination. In this measured labor, the practicality of his endeavor was established. If you're following John's journey, consider liking or subscribing for more detailed frontier survival stories. Construction commenced with the waning of daylight, the cold air sharp against John's cheeks as he surveyed the ridge where his cabin would stand. The ground remained frozen several inches deep, forcing repeated strikes of his spade to loosen the soil for a rudimentary foundation. Snow gathered in sheltered depressions, shifting with the wind and adding weight to logs yet to be lifted. John moved deliberately, aware that haste could result in injury or wasted effort. Each motion was measured, every step and swing of the axe calculated to preserve energy for the long hours ahead. The dog, a lean mixed breed with thick fur, padded alongside him, occasionally nosing through snowdrifts to recover small supplies or alert John to hidden obstacles. The animal's presence provided practical assistance rather than companionship. It marked objects and routes, returning promptly to the boy when directed. Logs were rolled, adjusted, and secured with rope improvised from fibers and leather strips, each action repeated until alignment and stability met John's assessment of structural soundness. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. John measured distances with the edge of his axe handle, checking for level planes, compacting soil, and shifting stones to reinforce corners. Each task was informed by necessity rather than trial, though mistakes occurred. A log slipped and required repositioning, frost cracked a sapling intended for support, and a small section of cleared earth had to be dug anew after a shift of soil. These were addressed immediately, methodically, without discussion beyond the occasional practical remark. "Keep the logs tight," John said quietly to himself as he adjusted the positioning, the words more a prompt for focus than conversation. He observed the changing light carefully, noting that shadows could conceal hazards and that surface ice grew slick with every passing minute. The wind intensified gradually, curling around unfinished walls, and carried with it the faint prelude of the next storm. Frost patterns on branches indicated accumulating weight and the potential for branches to break if ignored. Each observation was logged mentally and acted upon without delay. Labor continued with attention to sequence: foundation first, then walls, then roof supports. Tools were employed sparingly. Each strike of axe, swing of maul, and placement of wedge was deliberate. Even the process of collecting additional timber was integrated into the rhythm of construction, with short trips uphill to select the straightest logs and carry them down carefully to the foundation. John remained mindful of energy expenditure, measuring force against endurance and adjusting technique to avoid overexertion. As evening approached, he paused briefly to inspect the partial structure. The roof frame had begun to take shape, uneven yet stable. Snow had begun to settle on exposed logs, providing immediate feedback on potential weak points. The dog nosed among the stones at the foundation, alerting John to a small pocket where frost had loosened the earth. He corrected the issue promptly, using a wedge and pressure from a log to secure the corner. Dialogue remained minimal, functional, historically grounded. Darkness approached with sudden subtlety. Twilight bled into cold blue and gray, and temperatures fell noticeably. John gathered remaining tools and covered the exposed foundation with small branches and debris to slow frost accumulation. The ridge was quiet except for wind and the occasional groan of tree limbs. Progress was slow, deliberate, and measured against the season's constraints. Mist and early flurries hinted at the storm's return, but work had continued through necessity, not expectation. The cabin, in its incomplete state, already bore the imprint of careful labor, foresight, and adherence to the mountain's dictates. The storm arrived with a gradual insistence, first as a shifting gray over distant ridges, then as persistent snowflakes settling over John's partially completed cabin. The wind cut across the slope, bending young pines and carrying frost that settled on exposed logs. Temperatures dropped steadily, and the thin walls offered little protection. John moved between shelter points, reinforcing logs and securing corners, each action measured to conserve energy and reduce exposure. Snow accumulated quickly against the cabin's sides, pressing against the timber and testing stability. He adjusted each log carefully, sliding wedges into gaps where frost had forced separation. Every movement accounted for the slickness of snow and the uneven ground beneath. The dog, lean and alert, padded alongside, sniffing along exposed surfaces and retrieving small tools or bits of cord that had fallen. Its activity was practical, aiding John in maintaining efficiency while allowing him to focus on the structure itself. He did not speak beyond occasional practical instructions. Watch the corner, or move the log here. Dialogue remained minimal, functional, and grounded in immediate need. Snow deepened along the windward edge, forming drifts that pressed against his makeshift walls. Branches groaned and snapped under frost, occasionally landing near the foundation. John shifted logs preemptively, using the weight of one to stabilize another, testing each placement with deliberate pressure. Frost coated his gloves, stiffening his fingers, yet he continued with steady motion. Small errors, a log that rolled slightly, a wedge that failed to hold, were corrected without pause or complaint, the actions themselves communicating adaptation and learning. The storm's reach extended beyond immediate perception. Across the basin, townspeople observed the ridge and noted the persistence of snow and wind. They assumed the incomplete cabin would succumb, though none intervened. Their speculation remained quiet and factual. "He may find himself overexposed," one neighbor remarked, scanning the ridge. Another noted the wind's strength. "It carries frost farther than he can guard against." Their assessment reflected practical understanding, not concern or anticipation of drama. John monitored snow accumulation, noting the shifting weight against the structure. He leaned a small sapling at a precarious corner, bracing it with additional logs. Each placement considered the anticipated weight of fresh snow and the potential for drift formation. The wind drove needles and light frost into spaces between logs, and he adjusted rope bindings to prevent displacement. Every task adhered to a rhythm dictated by the storm itself, without improvisation beyond measured necessity. He paused intermittently to check footing and survey the surrounding slope. Snow obscured shallow depressions, hidden rocks, and potential hazards. Each step was deliberate. Miscalculation could compromise the cabin or his balance. Temporary shelters constructed from branches and debris were checked and reinforced, yet none offered significant relief from the cold or wind. The environment's impartiality was evident in each moment. Shelter was gained only through labor, observation, and adaptation. As night approached, the storm intensified. Visibility dropped to a narrow corridor, the ridge edges disappearing beneath white and gray. John continued, adjusting logs and securing corner braces, aware that retreat offered little advantage. The dog remained close, alert to shifted snow or tools that fell. Frost layered on clothing and hair, yet work continued with methodical persistence. Each action, measured and deliberate, ensured the incomplete cabin survived the first test of sustained winter. By the storm's end, the cabin remained standing. Snowdrifts pressed against its sides, logs held firmly despite shifting frost, and temporary shelters had endured. The slow, relentless pressure of the environment had been met with careful observation, measured labor, and the quiet application of skill. The ridge was silent, save for wind over drifts and the occasional groan of ice-laden trees, a landscape marked by the consequences of endurance and attention rather than dramatized struggle. The storm receded with gradual quietude, leaving the ridge bare of movement except for drifting snow and the groan of recovering branches. John emerged from the cabin's doorway, observing the accumulated drifts along the walls. The logs had settled without significant displacement, and the roof remained aligned despite the weight of snow and ice. Smoke rose steadily from the small chimney, curling into the gray morning sky, an unspoken confirmation of continued occupancy and warmth. Tracks in the surrounding snow marked movement, indicating supply trips and careful adjustment of timber. He checked the corners of the cabin, pressing a gloved hand against logs to detect shifts caused by frost or settling snow. Each corner was firm. The foundation had endured compression from wind-driven drifts. Small adjustments were made, tightening cord bindings, shifting a log that had loosened slightly, but the structure's integrity was intact. Inside, provisions were arranged to minimize exposure to cold, and the dog remained close to the hearth, nose to the floor, alert to both movement and temperature changes. John's actions were deliberate, measured, and continuous, reflecting observation of consequence rather than expression of triumph. Down in the valley, the local authority figure revisited his earlier assessments quietly. Through telescope and distance, he noted the cabin intact and signs of use, smoke rising, footprints leading back and forth, and no evidence of structural failure. He nodded, not in astonishment, but in practical acknowledgement. The environment had tested the boy's plan, and, for now, the proof was visible in the persistence of form and function. His remark to a neighbor was simple and measured. "It stands. He has managed what seemed unlikely." No further comment or embellishment followed. The elderly neighbor, observing from a distant ridge, noted John's labor through the lens of practicality. She recorded the survival in terms of continuity, smoke indicating warmth, tracks showing movement, and structural stability confirmed by the absence of collapse. She did not celebrate. Her acknowledgement was as reserved as her prior concerns. Winter had tested the cabin, and in its survival, she registered only the factual result. John stepped carefully along the snow-covered perimeter, checking for weak spots where drifted snow might accumulate in future storms. He shifted small stones at foundation edges, adjusted minor gaps between logs, and reinforced temporary windbreaks composed of branches and snow. Each task adhered to rhythm dictated by observation and necessity, rather than anticipation of reward. The dog padded close, retrieving tools and small items, facilitating labor without distraction. As daylight extended across the basin, the ridge revealed subtle changes from the storm. Branches bent but resilient, snow compacted against shelter walls, and exposed ground coated in frost. The boy moved among these indicators, confirming endurance and adjusting as needed. Each observation added to the record of survival: smoke rising, footprints persistent, structure undisturbed, and temporary shelters still functioning. The environment's impartiality remained evident. Resilience was documented only through evidence, labor, and an ongoing attentiveness. Evening approached with muted light, the wind softening to a consistent low whisper. John inspected the interior, ensuring supplies were accessible and that small adjustments would prevent snow intrusion. The dog curled near the hearth, alert but still, while the cabin's walls held against the evening chill. There was no sense of victory or performance, only recognition of continued survival. The ridge, blanketed in frost and snow, remained dominant, shaping every movement, every laborious task, and every measure of proof. The thaw arrived gradually, revealing the ridge beneath a patchwork of melting snow, hardened frost, and early spring growth. John moved along the perimeter of his cabin, inspecting logs for cracks, shifting stones, and the settling of corners after months of pressure from snow and wind. The structure had endured, its walls straight, roof aligned, and chimney intact. Smoke rose steadily in the morning light, marking both occupancy and continued function. Footprints in softened snow indicated measured movement and careful labor throughout the winter. Neighbors and community figures approached along the thawing trail with quiet, practical observation. The storekeeper and blacksmith noted the condition of the cabin without comment beyond factual acknowledgement. The logs remained in place, the roof bore no sagging, and the entrance was unobstructed. No applause or exclamations were offered. The authority figure from the valley nodded toward the ridge, marking approval through assessment of outcome rather than words. The acknowledgement was silent and matter-of-fact, registering the success without dramatization or sentiment. John engaged in practical maintenance, clearing residual snow, rearranging logs for future stability, and inspecting minor structural weaknesses. His movements were deliberate, grounded in physical observation and necessity. The dog padded alongside, alert to subtle sounds of thawing branches and distant wildlife, retrieving small tools and items left outside. Interaction remained functional, and John spoke only when a direction or brief instruction was required. Check the corner, or move the debris here. Dialogue did not intrude, existing solely to facilitate tasks. The ridge and surrounding slope bore the marks of the season, frozen drifts dissolving into mud, frost-laden pines dripping moisture onto the ground, and early buds emerging cautiously from bark. John used these environmental cues to anticipate future maintenance needs, adjusting logs and temporary reinforcements to accommodate runoff and shifting earth. Each action reflected learning from the winter's trial, a response to consequence rather than anticipation of praise. Community figures observed from distance. The elderly neighbor who had watched John leave the valley months prior recorded the state of the cabin in practical terms. She measured survival by endurance and labor rather than age or bravado. "It has held," she noted to the blacksmith quietly, eyes tracing the structure from ridge to ridge. There was no celebration, only acknowledgement of outcome and readiness for continued survival tasks. As John walked along the cabin's perimeter, he noted subtle shifts in the structure caused by melting snow, adjusting support logs where frost heave had created minor gaps. The dog remained close, moving between him and the outer walls, checking for fallen branches and carrying small items. The boy himself seemed taller, older in posture and movement, shaped by labor and endurance rather than the passing of months alone. Each step, each adjustment, was deliberate, silent, and functional. By afternoon, the ridge was quiet except for dripping water and soft wind across thawing slopes. John paused at the doorway, surveying the structure and surroundings. The cabin had survived without assistance, its endurance a record of measured effort and observation. Community perception had shifted subtly. Acceptance registered through quiet acknowledgement rather than words or ceremony. The boy's winter work was evident in every straight log, aligned corner, and persistent trace in the snow and soil. The environment remained dominant, its influence shaping every action, yet proof of survival existed in form and function, unadorned and unquestioned. Years later, the ridge remained marked by the traces of John's labor, the cabin standing as a quiet testament to careful planning and measured effort. A legacy witness, passing along a distant trail, I observed the structure with practical attention. The logs held firm, the roof aligned without sag, and the chimney remained intact. Snow and wind had reshaped the surrounding slopes over time, yet the cabin endured, maintaining both form and function through repeated seasons. The witness moved along the edge of the ridge, noting how each log had settled into place, gaps between them minimal and reinforced over time. Small details, such as the arrangement of corner braces and stone foundation, indicated foresight and adaptation. The environment's ongoing pressure was evident in minor adjustments made to support structures, yet the cabin had withstood repeated winter trials. Tracks near the doorway showed occasional visits, evidence of practical upkeep rather than ceremonial attention. Birdsong and distant river flow marked the passing seasons, yet the cabin remained an enduring point of reference on the landscape. The witness did not speak to the structure or to anyone else. Observation was sufficient. Every straight log and preserved corner demonstrated that human labor, applied carefully and with forethought, could leave a lasting imprint even in an indifferent environment. The ridge, frost-laden in early winter and greened with spring thaw, continued its natural cycles, shaping and testing structures with impartial consistency. Further along, patches of early growth highlighted how time had altered the immediate surroundings. Wind and water had shifted minor stones and branches, yet the cabin had accommodated these changes without collapse. Evidence of John's methodical work persisted, timber tightly interlocked, the corners reinforced, chimney standing straight against repeated snow loads. Even in his absence, the structure conveyed knowledge, skill, and endurance to anyone capable of careful observation. The ridge remained quiet, the wind passing over thawed slopes, and the snowmelt creating rivulets along the foundation. The witness noted the cabin's durability without commentary, reflecting only on what could be verified through sight and careful inspection. John's achievement was implied through the continued presence and resilience of the cabin, a record of labor meeting environmental challenge. Nothing else, no celebration, no moral framing, was necessary. Survival itself served as proof. As the observer departed, the cabin receded into distance, yet retained its clarity against the sky and slope. The environment continued its impartial cycles, indifferent but predictable, offering both challenge and evidence of what careful labor could endure. John's presence was measured not by words or memory, but by the quiet, steadfast structure that outlasted storms, seasons, and years. The ridge held the record of endurance, a precise measure of foresight, skill, and restraint, applied by a boy who had learned to live under winter's demands.